There was a child who forgot what bread tasted like. Her name was Anna, and she was 9 years old when the siege began. She lived in the fortress with her mother, a seamstress who mended soldiers' uniforms, and her father, a blacksmith who repaired weapons and armor. When the Empire's army arrived, 100,000 strong, and surrounded the fortress, Anna thought it would be over quickly. Either the soldiers would drive them away, or the gates would open and everyone would surrender. She did not understand that she was about to spend an entire year trapped inside stone walls, that she would watch people starve, watch them die from disease, watch them throw themselves from the ramparts rather than endure one more day of suffering. She did not understand that bread, the simple food she had eaten every morning of her life, would become a memory, a dream, something she would fantasize about while chewing on boiled leather and thanking God it was something to put in her mouth. This is the story of how a single fortress held back 100,000 invaders for an entire year, not because the defenders were superhuman, but because they had nowhere else to go, because surrender meant death or slavery, because every day they held was one more day for Allied reinforcements to arrive, and because sometimes the human capacity for endurance is greater than any army's capacity for patience. This is the story of the fortress of Kerak, and it begins with a simple question. How long can people survive when survival seems impossible? Do you know what an impregnable fortress looks like? Kerak was built on a mountain peak, 3,000 feet above the valley floor. The only approach was a single winding road, barely wide enough for a cart, carved into the cliff face. The fortress walls were 40 feet high, 10 feet thick, made of stone that had been quarried from the mountain itself. There were 4 defensive towers, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Inside the walls were barracks, armories, storehouses, a well that drew water from an underground spring, and enough space for 8,000 people to live, at least in theory. The fortress had been designed to be self-sufficient, to withstand any siege, to be the shield that protected the kingdom's northern border. And for 200 years, it had never fallen. Not to assault, not to siege, not to treachery. It was called impregnable because no one had ever found a way to break it. But the Empire was about to test that claim, not with cleverness or innovation, but with sheer, overwhelming, relentless pressure. 100,000 soldiers, unlimited resources, and time. All the time in the world. The Empire had been expanding for a generation. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen. Armies had been crushed. Cities had been sacked. And now, the Empire stood at the border of the last free kingdom in the region. Between them and the conquest stood Kerak. The fortress controlled the only pass through the mountains. Any army that wanted to invade would have to go through it. The Empire's generals studied the fortress and made their calculations. A direct assault would be costly. The approach road was a killing ground. Siege engines would be difficult to position, but they had 100,000 men. They could afford losses. They could afford time. They would surround the fortress, cut it off from all supplies, and wait for starvation to do what their soldiers could not. It was simple mathematics. The fortress had supplies for 6 months, maybe 8 if they rationed carefully. After that, the defenders would have to surrender or die. The Empire gave the fortress one chance. Surrender now, and the garrison would be allowed to leave with their weapons and honor. Refuse, and everyone inside would be killed when the fortress finally fell. The fortress commander, Colonel Theron, a veteran of 30 years who had defended Kerak for a decade, sent back a one-word reply. No. Inside the fortress were 8,000 people, 3,000 soldiers, 2,000 militia, civilians who could fight if needed, and 3,000 more civilians, families of soldiers, tradespeople, children. They could not evacuate. The Empire's army had already surrounded the fortress. Anyone who tried to leave would be captured or killed. So they stayed, and they prepared for what everyone knew was coming. A siege that would test the limits of human endurance. Colonel Theron gathered everyone in the fortress square and told them the truth. We have had food for 6 months, water for years, as long as the well holds. The Empire will try to starve us out, but help is coming. The king has been notified. Allied armies are mobilizing. If we can hold for 6 months, maybe 8, reinforcements will arrive and break the siege. Until then, we hold. We do not surrender. We do not give up. We hold and pray that we last long enough. The people listened. Some cried. Some prayed. But most just nodded. Because they understood. There was no choice. They were going to fight. Or they were going to die trying. The first month was almost bearable. The food was rationed, but there was enough. The well provided clean water. The soldiers were disciplined and organized. The civilians adapted to the confined space, the constant tension, the sound of the Empire's army camped below. The Empire did not attack immediately. They set up their camps, built siege engines, positioned archers and catapults. They were in no hurry. Tom was on their side. Every day that passed, the fortress consumed more supplies. Every week brought them closer to starvation. Why waste soldiers when hunger would do the work for them? But the fortress did not just wait. Colonel Theron organized raids. Small groups of soldiers would sneak out at night, down the treacherous mountain paths that only locals knew, and attack the Empire's supply lines. They burned wagons, poisoned water, killed sentries. They could not break the siege, but they could make it expensive, make the Empire bleed, make them pay for every day they sit outside the walls. And it worked. The Empire lost hundreds of men to these raids, lost supplies, lost morale. The siege was supposed to be easy. Just wait for the fortress to starve. But the defenders were not cooperating. They were fighting back. And that changed everything. By the third month, the food situation was critical. The initial supplies had been calculated for 6 months of normal rationing. But normal rationing assumes people doing light work. The defenders were fighting, repairing walls, building defenses, conducting raids. They were burning calories faster than expected. Colonel Theron cut rations again. 1 meal a day, then half a meal. Bread became a luxury. Meat became a memory. They started eating things no one would have considered food before the siege. Rats, insects. The leather boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Grass and weeds pulled from cracks in the stone. Anna, the 9-year-old girl, stopped complaining about being hungry. Everyone was hungry. Complaining did not help. She watched her mother grow thin, watched her father's hands shake as he worked the forge, and she tried to help however she could. She carried water. She helped the healers tend to wounded soldiers. She sang songs to keep children's spirits up. Because even in hell, even when you are starving, you still need a reason to keep going. And for Anna, that reason was making others smile, even for a moment. The Empire tried assaults in the 4th month. Waves of soldiers marching up the approach road, carrying ladders and shields, trying to reach the walls. It was a slaughter. The road was so narrow that only 20 men could advance side by side. The defenders rained arrows and stones and boiling oil down on them. Bodies piled up on the road. The Empire lost 3,000 men in a week of assaults and gained nothing. Not a foot of ground. Not a crack in the walls. The fortress held, but the cost was exhausting. Every assault drained the defenders' energy. Every arrow fired was one less in the armory. Every stone thrown was one they would not have for the next attack. Colonel Theron knew they could not sustain this. The Empire could keep sending men until the defenders ran out of ammunition or collapsed from exhaustion. So he changed tactics. He stopped trying to kill every attacker. Instead, he focused on making the assaults so costly that the Empire would stop attempting them. He positioned archers to target officers, used the fortress's catapults to collapse sections of the approach road, making it even more treacherous, made every attack a nightmare. And eventually, the Empire stopped, went back to waiting for hunger to finish the job. By the 6th month, people were dying, not from enemy action, from starvation and disease. Scurvy appeared when the last of the preserved vegetables ran out. Dysentery spread through the crowded living quarters. People weakened by hunger had no resistance to illness. The infirmary was overflowing. The healers did what they could, but medicine was running out. Bodies were buried in a mass grave inside the fortress because they could not risk going outside to bury them properly. Anna's father died in the 7th month. Not from battle, from disease. His body, weakened by malnutrition, could not fight the infection that took him. Anna and her mother held him as he died. He whispered that he was proud of them, that they had to keep going. That help was coming. And then he was gone. Anna did not cry. She had no tears left. Just emptiness. Just the gnawing hunger that never stopped and the question that everyone was asking. Where were the reinforcements? The king had promised help. 6 months, he had said. 8 at most. It had been 7, and there was no sign of rescue. Colonel Theron faced a mutiny in the 8th month. A group of soldiers, desperate and starving, demanded that he surrender, that he save the people who were still alive instead of sacrificing everyone for a lost cause. Theron understood their desperation. He felt it too, but he also knew that surrender meant death. The Empire had made that clear. They would execute the garrison for the defiance. The civilians would be enslaved. There was no mercy coming from that army. So he made a speech that became legendary. He gathered everyone who could still stand and told them the truth. We are dying. I know. You know. But we are not dead yet. Every day we hold is one more day our kingdom has to prepare. One more day for reinforcements to arrive. One more day that the Empire's resources are tied up here instead of invading our homeland. We are not just defending a fortress. We are defending everyone behind us. Our families. Our nation. Our future. If we surrender, they die. If we hold, they live. So we hold. Until we cannot hold anymore. And then we hold a little longer. The mutiny dissolved. Not because people believed rescue was coming, but because Theron had reminded them why they were suffering. It was not for glory. It was for the people they loved who were still free. The Empire tried one more massive assault in the 9th month. They had brought up their best troops, their siege engines, everything they had. They were tired of waiting, tired of the casualties from raids, tired of sitting outside a fortress that should have fallen months ago. They launched a coordinated attack. Siege towers rolled up the approach road. Battering rams were carried by dozens of men. Thousands of soldiers marched behind them. The defenders, weak from starvation, fought with everything they had left. They set the siege towers on fire, dropped the rams into ravines, killed attackers with their last arrows, and then resorted to throwing stones by hand. The battle lasted 12 hours. When it ended, the Empire had lost another 5,000 men. And the fortress still stood. But the cost was devastating. The defenders had lost 800 soldiers. They were down to fewer than 2,000 fighting men. And there was almost no food left. No ammunition. No hope. Just stubbornness. Just the refusal to give the Empire what it wanted. Anna's mother died in the 10th month. From starvation. She had been giving her food to Anna, telling her daughter that she had already eaten, lying so that Anna would have a better chance of survival. Anna found out too late. Found her mother collapsed in their quarters, too weak to stand. She held her mother's hand as life faded from her eyes. And this time, Anna did cry. Because she was alone now. An orphan at 10 years old, trapped in a fortress full of dying people, waiting for a rescue that was never coming. She wanted to give up. Wanted to lie down next to her mother and just stop. But she remembered what her father had said. Keep going. And she remembered Colonel Theron's speech. They were holding for the people behind them, for the kingdom, for the future. So she kept going. She helped the healers. She carried water to soldiers on the walls. She sang to the children who were too weak to play. And she survived. One more day, and then another. In the 11th month, something changed. Scouts on the walls reported that the Empire's camps were shrinking. Units were pulling out. Not all of them, but thousands of soldiers were marching away. Colonel Theron did not understand at first. Then a messenger got through. A single rider who had snuck past the Empire's lines with news. The siege had worked. Not the way they thought. The Empire had poured so many resources into besieging Karak, had lost so many men to raids and assaults, had spent so much time and money on a fortress that refused to fall, that it had drained their economy. Taxes had increased. Other regions had been stripped of garrisons to reinforce the siege, and those regions had rebelled. Internal uprisings had erupted across the Empire. The Emperor had been forced to pull troops away from Karak to deal with the rebellions. And those rebellions were spreading. The Empire was collapsing, not from military defeat, but from overextension, from spending too much on one fortress. The messenger also brought news that Allied reinforcements were finally coming. They would arrive within 2 weeks. All Karak had to do was hold a little longer. Just 2 more weeks. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the entire year. The defenders were down to 5,000 people. Half of the original number. Most were too weak to fight. They were eating anything they could find: boiled boots, grass, paste made from ground bones. But they held. The empire, distracted by internal problems, launched no more assaults. They just maintained the siege, hoping the fortress would finally surrender. It did not. On the 364th day of the siege, Allied banners appeared on the horizon. 30,000 fresh soldiers, marching to break the siege. The empire's remaining forces, demoralized and outnumbered, withdrew without a fight. They had spent a year trying to take Kerak, lost 20,000 men, drained their resources to the breaking point, and gained nothing. The fortress had been held. When the gates finally opened, the Allied commanders rode in expecting to find triumphant defenders. Instead, they found ghosts, skeletal figures who could barely stand, children with hollow eyes, a fortress that smelled of death and desperation. Colonel Theron, who had lost half his body weight, greeted them with simple words. "You took your time, but you are here. We held." The Allies brought food, medicine, supplies, and the survivors ate slowly, their bodies too damaged to handle real food after a year of starvation. Anna was among the survivors. At 10 years old, she had endured something that would have broken most adults. She had lost both parents, had watched thousands die, had gone months eating things that were not meant to be food. But she survived, and when the Allied commander asked her how, asked what had kept her going, she gave an answer that became famous. "I kept going because stopping meant they won, and I was not going to let them win." The year-long defense of Kerak became legendary. 8,000 defenders had held back 100,000 invaders, had cost the empire so dearly that it had sparked rebellions and eventual collapse. Within 5 years, the empire fragmented completely, torn apart by internal strife and regional uprisings. Historians would point to many causes, but those who studied closely knew the truth. It started at Kerak, with a fortress that refused to fall, with defenders who chose suffering over surrender, with Colonel Theron, who died 2 months after the siege ended. His body was too damaged to recover, with 3,000 civilians who never made it out, but whose sacrifice bought time for a kingdom to survive, and with a child named Anna, who forgot what bread tasted like, but never forgot why she had to keep fighting. Monuments were built, names were recorded, and every year, on the anniversary of the siege's end, the kingdom holds a ceremony at Kerak. They read the names of those who died, all 5,000 of them, and they remember that freedom is not free, that sometimes survival requires suffering beyond imagination, that sometimes a single fortress can change the course of history, not by winning, but by refusing to lose. Anna lived to be an old woman. She got married. I had children and grandchildren, and every year, she returned to Kerak for the ceremony. She would stand at the walls where she had carried water to dying soldiers, where she had sung songs to frightened children, where she had watched her parents die, and she would whisper the same thing every time. We held. For 364 days, we held. And because we held, the kingdom survived. That was enough. That had to be enough. This is the story of how a single fortress held back 100,000 invaders for an entire year, not through superior tactics or brilliant strategy, but through endurance, through the refusal to quit, through the understanding that sometimes the greatest weapon is not a sword or a wall. It is the human spirit's capacity to endure, to suffer, to keep going when every rational calculation says to stop. Kerak still stands. The walls have been repaired. The fortress is garrisoned again. But if you look closely at the stones, you can still see marks from the siege. Scorch marks from siege engines, chips from catapult stones, and carved into the gate, barely visible, a single line. 364 days, 8,000 souls, one fortress, unbroken.